to have the Honourable Minister of Transport, Minister Chikunga, with us. The Minister's got quite a background and exposure to the department from being a Deputy Minister and now the Minister. And we've actually all seen the good work that Minister is busy with. And before I hand over to Minister, I just want to say that, this session is actually very important to the economy. When you consider the trade openness index of a country, it stands around 56%. Now, that implies, if you take your imports plus your exports and you divide it with your GDP, so 56% of cargo, of a GDP value is at risk if we don't have proper logistics systems and if our, cross-border movements are in jeopardy. So we need to really start addressing some of these issues, but also look at the opportunities. Now, there's not the ideal number that your trade openness index must be, but we need to facilitate this to ensure smooth flows through the system. But I think without further ado, let me allow Minister, and you can just give her a good welcome, just to do opening remarks and speech, and then we'll continue the questions of the rest of the panel. Minister, welcome.
Thank you very much, Program Director, colleagues, government officials, captains of the industry and the private sector broadly, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. As we stand on the threshold of 3 decades of democracy in South Africa, it is both an honor and a privilege to be part of this critically important symposium on sustainable infrastructure development, and to specifically thank the organizers for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion on cross-border infrastructure and on the matter of ports and logistics. Cross-border is not only limited to roads infrastructure, but also air, which is aviation, sea, maritime, and rail transport as such. And transport and logistics are the catalyst of economic growth. And as a continent, we need to ensure ongoing investment in our transport infrastructure and the regulatory services, including the licensing. As a continent and a region, we have introduced instruments that seek to harmonize standards as well improve efficiencies and thus impacting positively on our growing economies. These include, the instruments include, for instance, in cross-border road transport, we have Linking Africa Plan, which is a continental transport and trade plan whose main purpose is to enhance the performance of the regional transport systems, thus enhancing intra-Africa trade and industrialization in the continent. Program Director, as part of its ongoing work of driving harmonization on the continent, the Cross-Border Road Transport Agency of South Africa has recently launched an online permit application system which was well received by the cross-border road transport operators. The Cross-Easy Permit application system revolutionized the permit issuance in the cross-border road transport industry by making it easier for the operators to apply for permits from anywhere, anytime, without having to go to the CPRTA offices. We urge all countries in the SADC region and the continent to adopt the system as a way of standardizing permit administration in the region. So far, the CPRTA is in the final stages of preparing for the Cross-Easy implementation in Lesotho and Angola, starting with a 2-year pilot, whilst awaiting the finalization of the negotiations with the DRC. You will agree that such investment will support our ideals of economic growth in our own country, but more importantly in the SADC region and beyond. So the instruments are there for the region and the continent. Now we need to fast-track the implementation with a view to crowding investment. Distinguished delegates, the fact that over 90% of the trade between South Africa and the neighboring countries is still transported by road, it highlights both the importance of critical road freight transport in ensuring the last mile delivery in 100% of all trade. It is therefore important that the road network and the supporting regulatory services resonate with this reality. As part of the transport sector contributions towards infrastructure and infrastructure build that stimulate economic growth and job creation, the program of action for the roads infrastructure sector includes the implementation of road maintenance, construction and upgrading projects. Our national road infrastructure is constructed, upgraded and maintained by the South African National Road Agency Limited, SANRAL, and the SANRAL implements a massive capital works program which includes expansion of strategic economic national road infrastructure that connects South Africa to other neighboring countries like Eswatini, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and so forth. This is done through concessions and other direct national financial injections. Investing on road infrastructure is a critical enabler to facilitate trade and drive economic growth for countries within the continent. From 2024 to 2028, SANRAL will, for the next 5 years, SANRAL will embark on the toll and non-toll projects to the value of 230 billion rand, which will create 123,800 full-time employment. I must say that SANRAL's capability and capacity expands to being able to assist or to partner with the continent in road infrastructure construction, upgrades and maintenance. From a mere 7,200 kilometers in 1998, now SANRAL owns and manages a whopping 24,300 kilometers national road, which increases the best managed roads in South Africa. I know that SANRAL is available to establish partnerships to build roads for the continent. The CEO will further elaborate on SANRAL's current projects and how this investment will impact in supporting the African continent free trade area. In the realm of transportation, South Africa has invested significantly in modernizing its national road, rail, ports, and air networks. On ports logistics efficiencies, Africa as a continent is surrounded by oceans and seas, thus making it a maritime and a port continent. The 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy, IM, is a critical instrument in driving the continent's growth and economic development through increased cooperation and integration among African states. For this strategy to materialize, we need to build efficiencies in the port systems and processes through infrastructure build. Ports represent the gateway for commodity exports. They are essential for sustaining and improving more robust and diverse growth in African economies through the import and exports of manufactured goods and other products. Ports then become a critical part of the supply chain in our continent. Globally, ports are gateways for 80% trade by volumes and 70% by value. Investment in ports and the related transport infrastructure to advance trade and promote overall economic development and growth is critical, especially in emerging economies. As a continent, we must accelerate port market access and trade both across the region, continent, and with the rest of the world if we want to stimulate economic growth, diversify our continental economies, reduce inflationary effects of weak transport and logistics infrastructure, become globally competitive while creating jobs and reducing poverty. In South Africa, we have recently adopted our National Freight Logistic Roadmap with its implementation plan, which is a blueprint to assist and provide guidance for the country to urgently tackle the crisis that has plagued the logistics sector. The roadmap seeks to ensure that transport contributes to its national task as an economic and social enabler, guaranteeing that the logistics system is seamless and cost affordable. As His Excellency the President stated earlier this morning, the roadmap has brought together public and private sectors and is beginning to yield results. We now have an interim infrastructure manager in Transnet Freight Rail. Our National Treasury has agreed on deviations to procure much required equipment, thus improving operational efficiencies. On rail, moving freight from road to rail, requires an efficient and fully functional freight rail network that is fully integrated with other modes, cost-effective and efficient in moving large quantities over long distances. Regional rail development is critical to advance Africa's rail development through regional integration structures such as Southern African Rail Association, that is SARA. As per the African Union Heads of States Resolution of 2015, which assigned South Africa to manufacture new trains and be the distributor of train equipment or parts needed by the continent. We have fulfilled that mandate and have an established train manufacturing capabilities and capacities for the country as well as the continent. As a matter of fact, we are already manufacturing trains for ourselves, but of course we can even for the continent. We are open for business and we are currently accepting orders for both new and overhauled train sets as well as train equipment. We also have in place a formally approved parliament legal instrument, that is the Luxembourg Protocol, which allows the country to partner with other African countries as a manufacturer of trains. We have recently received cabinet approval for private sector participation, which is a critical framework to facilitate the institutional structure of railways within the context of the rail reforms. The PSP, that is the private sector participation framework, is one of key levers in driving efficiency and improving rail competitiveness, and introduces concessions to enable private sector investment nationally and across the continent. On passenger and freight rail, the government of South Africa took a bold and ambitious step to inject massive investments in freight and commuter rail in the form of billions of rands rolling stock fleet renewal program. In aviation, we are implementing the Single Africa Air Transport Market through the Single African Air Transport Market Pilot Implementation Project, which includes 18 African states, and South Africa is one of them. South Africa has ensured that all our transport bilateral air service agreements feature the SATIM approach. In line with our bilateral agreements in the aviation infrastructure, AXA and ATNS air traffic and navigation services are available to partner with African states that require world-class infrastructure built to ensure continental transport integration and seamless travel that aligns with the needs of our society and the global imperative of economic growth, sustainability, safety, and efficiency. These partnerships are driven by the need to ensure that as African continent, we meet the current infrastructure needs while also ensuring preparedness to fulfill future demands. Domestically, we have recently announced major capital investments projects to the tune of 21.7 billion rands earmarked for airport development, refurbishment, efficiency improvement, maintenance, statutory compliance measures with the aim to enhance asset availability, airport safety, and passenger experiences in our airports across the country. We have, as South Africa, developed a conducive regulatory environment bolstered by policies, legislations, strategies, and frameworks. Ultimately, our ultimate goal being the establishment of an inclusive beneficial environment, a highly integrated transport system that enables the logistics value chain to thrive. We are not yet there and not yet where we want to be, but are striving towards ensuring that our freight and logistics systems increase the required levels of efficiency. The truth, though, is that for the African continent to thrive and realize the wealth from its resources, we need to create regional and continental integration that leaves no one behind, because together we are better. Through that, the benefits of the African Free Trade Agreement will become our reality. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And, we are so happy that you shared, what the department is currently embarking on and all the potential benefits that we will see. And I'm so happy you also alluded to leave no one behind. I've also noted that in your profile you are so focused on uplifting of rural areas and the socio-economic development of rural areas. And, you know, in 2004, the World Bank did a study on the rural accessibility of a country. And at that stage, they found that only 21% of the rural people have acceptable access in terms of their definition, which is 2 kilometers within a paved road. Now, my team did this work for the entire country, and you know, that number has now actually improved to 30%. So there's at least an improvement, Minister. And, you know, I think, you know, the challenges are great. We must acknowledge it. But, you know, we also have to focus on rural areas because currently we also sit with, still with 18 million population in rural areas. And I can perhaps just add that, you know, out of the worst rural accessibility, the 10 worst areas, only one had a negative decline in population in a 10-year period. So the notion that, you know, the rural areas are losing population is not always true. And I think that's why we need to monitor data and so on. But we actually also have, and Minister, all protocols observed. I forgot to state that in my introduction. We also have a wonderful panel with us today. You know, we have the CEO of SANRAL, you know, Mr. Reginald Domana. So also welcome to you, sir. We have Dr. Andrew Shaw, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Transnet. I think quite a daunting task. Andrew, welcome. We also have the consulting industry with us today. Mr. Yash Ramkola, sorry for that. He's the CEO of DNA Economics and a strong focus on trade policy and trade-related matters. And then we also have business with us today, Peter Van Drel from the NEPAD Business Forum. So welcome to all of you. So I think it's actually a very good mix in terms of the panel. I will start my first question to you, Reggie, in terms of the SANRAL initiatives. Maybe you can just get your mic. They will switch the mic on for you, so you don't have to do that. Can you please share with us, you know, if SANRAL is currently embarking on any international cross-border initiatives? So any of the cross-border initiatives from a tolling perspective or perhaps a non-toll perspective? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Program Director, good afternoon, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocols observed. I think for SANRAL, cross-border initiatives are not new. The most well-known partnership that we have is the Maputo Development Corridor, which is that N4 highway. On the western side, it connects South Africa with Botswana, and then to the east, it connects us with Mozambique. And it was developed on the Mpumalanga side and Mozambique. It was developed as a cross-border bilateral agreement between South Africa and Mozambique. It is in its, I think, 25th year. It's remaining with 5 years, so it was a 30-year concession. So that's something that has worked very well and successful. And we continue to look at how we can enhance it from a border perspective to make sure that there are improvements done there. And those initiatives also involve Transnet, for example, through the National Logistics Crisis Committee. We are looking at also a new initiative with Zimbabwe on the N1 at the Beit Bridge border, where together with the Zimbabweans and championed by the President and the Minister, is to look at a potential development of another bridge because there is increased traffic there. That bridge will be on a tolling basis. There is a bridge with the Zimbabweans already toll on their side. So it is really to add another one and increase capacity to facilitate crossing of the of the border. So that's an initiative in its early stage, but we really think that it is something that is very doable and will be economically viable. We are also looking at upgrading another road in Matatiela, R4, I think it's R415. That road is a piece of gravel road in the Eastern Cape. It connects South Africa and the Kingdom of Lesotho at Kasha's Neck border post. It is something where we must upgrade that gravel road into a surfaced road to facilitate trade and tourism between South Africa as well as the Kingdom of Lesotho. So those are some of the initiatives that are currently underway. But of course, other roads that are important in connecting to the neighboring countries will be N17 that connects us with Eswatini, as well as the N7 here in Cape Town that connects us to Namibia. On the Namibian side, they are doing their own expansions because that road further connects us up to Angola via Namibia. So those are some of the initiatives that we're working on currently. Thank you.
Thank you. And you can also see that, you know, the SANRAL is really busy with lots of initiatives also across the continent. So we are really impressed. And, you know, it was also noteworthy that the Minister and the President also referred to the good work being done at SANRAL. So well done to you, sir. Andrew, now over to you from a Transnet perspective. And, you know, about 10 years ago in my previous career, I was involved with the establishment of a rail economic regulatory capacity for the DOT. And I'm so glad to read in the newspapers that this has really now come to fruition. So can you perhaps just elaborate on the plans of TFR especially, how they plan to open the network for private rail participation? So this, you know, it's actually, you know, rail economic regulation is very important for us in the country in terms of, you know, the avoidance of market dominance as well as, you know, opening access to the private operators. So maybe you can just tell us in terms of the planning. I think it's 21,000 kilometers, if I remember correctly, your rail system, but you can perhaps just elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, Programme Director and other guests. I think this comes at quite an opportune time to give you a sense of where we stand with this process, because on Friday we released the network statement, which is one of the critical requirements from us as Transnet. We have gone through the process of separating the infrastructure manager from Transnet Freight Rail Operations, so that creates two separate entities. The initial process is to do that from an accounting perspective, but institutionally we need to separate those two, and we need to separate the systems that we have, subsystems around that. We are driving that process rapidly and will create the management structure within the next 3 to 4 months around complete separation to oversee those two entities. The network statement encompasses the conditions under which operators can operate on the network. So it provides a sense of the rules, the responsibilities that we have in terms of managing the slot capacity, some of the challenges around meeting the performance requirements of the network, which has been underinvested in. And as has been in the news, it also indicates the proposed tariff. And the proposed tariff is a network-wide tariff on a ton per kilometre basis of 19.7 cents per ton kilometre. I think what is misinterpreted perhaps in the media is that's a requirement from us from a regulatory standpoint. And so there is a regulator, and you're in the room, so it's good to have you here. From an interim standpoint, there's an IRAC, an interim regulator. And we need to meet the requirements of any regulatory provision. Remember, in Transnet, we have Transnet National Ports Authority, and we have pipelines, both of which have a similar regulatory ambit. So we follow very much those precincts. It's not like we can vary those in any particular way. The network statement is released now for public comment, and my understanding is it was published in the Government Gazette today. IRAC, as the interim regulator, will manage that process of receiving those public comments and initiating the process of engaging with various stakeholders. So that's not our process. That's a process that is run by IRAC, which reports directly to the Minister. And my understanding, Minister, is that IRAC would provide you with recommendations at the end of that process as to how to proceed prior to the TER bill, which is currently before the President for signature, prior to that bill being finalized. Thereafter, a full regulator will be set in place. So there's a number of moving parts to this process. And we want to make sure from Transnet that we're not seen to be delaying any part of this. We have very strict conditions from National Treasury under which we have been given some guarantee support of 47 billion, and this was one of the conditions. So one of the 21 conditions was to publish the network statement on the 15th. So we met that. We are proud of that. It's been a tough road, and we would support industry and the regulator in terms of taking the comments around that. And also, just finally, in respect to the tariff, to say that this is not necessarily there for the final tariff. It's the tariff that we've calculated using an appropriate methodology. And like you've seen with NERSA and others, the regulator takes their own view of what that tariff should ultimately be and how it should be applied. The one thing that we wish to say is that we have applied a network tariff on the basis that we need to protect an economic network for South Africa. And that means that the network cannot have very intensively used parts of the network having lower tariffs than less intensively used parts of the network that serve only particular customers. We have a responsibility, as the DOT is aware, for example, in airports and in roads, that you have to serve the interest of the whole country. So that's the reason why there's a network-wide tariff. And if you look globally, you'll see that network-wide tariffs are the common methodology. It's very seldom that you will see variation from this approach. There are variations, not to say that there are not. So that's really why we've put that forward. So maybe just if I can quickly just state in the last part of that process is that we would hope to be enable the first round of third-party access from June this year on the basis of the process that would be run by IRAC over the next month. But of course that would not be the final process because the full regulatory responsibility still needs to be set in place. So it would probably be only from April of 26 that you would have a complete separation of full regulatory responsibility, complete clarity of all the institutional roles and responsibilities. So we are going into a transition phase which is being driven very hard by both DOT and Operation Vulindlela to enable third-party access onto the network. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very happy that when you refer to the, tariff setting, that you followed the whole network approach, because, that's typically one of the most complex areas when you do your economic regulation, and it's perhaps some of the areas that people just underestimate and do not follow the correct methodology. So I'm very impressed with that, Andrew, I must confess. And Minister, perhaps if time allows, maybe you can just give us an update of how this will link up to the single transport economic regulator. I know that process, there's also legislation in place, so if you don't mind, just if time permits, that you can just give us an update with that. I think it's really relevant to this discussion. Thank you, Minister. So, Yash, over to you from the consulting space. You've been, in terms of your profile, it looked like you've been involved quite a lot in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And maybe you can just give us an insight in terms of the policy challenges that you've experienced, because you are a policy expert. So maybe share some views on that.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Honourable Minister. And also thanks very much to my panellists and Infrastructure South Africa for the invitation, and then also Dr. Jones as well. Thank you very much. I guess my focus is really on transport infrastructure as a facilitator of trade. And if we're looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area, it's been in the making for, depending on your view, as long as 2 decades, possibly 4, depending on the context from which you're coming from. But momentum has really spiraled, or not spiraled, but actually gained a lot of traction in the last 10 years or so. The focus has really been on African integration through a negotiated process, looking primarily at the reduction of import duties, and using that to drive integration within Africa and industrial development. But if you look at transport as a facilitator of trade, and within that context, what the need is in the African context, inter-African exports accounted for roughly $100 billion in 2022. And that accounted for about 15% of Africa's total exports. A very big number, but if you put it in context, comparatively low. So if you compare it to the Americas, 40% of intra-America's trade accounted for about 40% of their total trade. In Asia, that was about 50%. In Europe, it's more than 60%. And so even though in absolute numbers, intra-African trade is a substantial portion of total trade, in relative terms, it still has quite a bit of catching up to do. And where does transport come in that? So I mentioned that a large focus of the African Continental Free Trade Area has been in the reduction of import duties, and that's where a substantial portion of the negotiations have focused. And a lot of progress has been made on that. There are a number of piloted initiatives looking at how to trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area. But in reality, we know that non-tariff barriers are the biggest portion of cost to trading in Africa. And within that, the non-tariff barriers account for a range of things. So issues around logistics, issues around border issues, issues related to the standardization of products and how you actually get that alignment across countries. But transport is a big component of that. And so if you look at the transport side, estimates suggest that the biggest cost, the cost of transportation in Africa is around double that of other regions. I've seen estimates that suggest that import duties are only about a 20th of the total cost of trading across borders. And so getting transport right and getting transport infrastructure right is a big factor in ensuring that Africa can trade with Africa. And so focusing on infrastructure, we've looked at the need. Understanding the opportunity, I think, is the next big one. And so from a financing perspective, there is huge opportunity to provide financing for infrastructure and profitable financing. When I talk about profitable financing, if you look at PPPs as an example, to ensure that infrastructure can be financed, but also that there's sufficient return generated for that infrastructure. As one of the panelists mentioned, that obviously relates substantially to the way in which network tariffs are designed and created. So if you look at the opportunity, what is the opportunity? And again, a range of estimates. Some estimates I've seen are that the financing requirement is about $150 billion a year in terms of total infrastructure need in Africa. Transport accounts for about 30% of that in terms of estimates. And in terms of the financing deficit, some estimates suggest that there's a financing deficit of about 40%. And so the question then is, how do you get that financing deficit filled? And I think that's where it comes down to innovative financing mechanisms. Increasingly important is the participation of the private sector, and then alongside that, ensuring that the chicken and egg story is solved. And when I refer to the chicken and egg story, I think increasingly what we're seeing is that there is no shortage of demand for different types of infrastructure. The most popular example in Africa being electricity. But while there is quantifiable demand, if I call it that, often there isn't the immediate revenue generation capability from infrastructure that's been put in place. And so what you need to address there is to put in place very innovative, as an option, innovative network tariffs, or innovative tariffs, or an innovative financing mechanism. And so, for example, one thing that could be put in place as an example is escalating tariffs that start off very low to encourage demand and encourage revenue generation through that demand, and those tariffs escalate quite substantially over time. And so addressing the chicken and egg story, I think, is a key component in terms of developing innovative finance mechanisms. Thanks.
Thank you, Yash. So Peter, You've also been greatly involved with the North-South Rail project, and I think everybody has heard of this project, but we are keen to just get an insight on what's really happening on that project, because we still see all these copper trucks, from the copper belt damaging our road network and causing unnecessary congestion. So maybe you can just elaborate on that.
Thank you very much, Moderator. Greetings to the Minister and fellow colleagues on the panel. So maybe just to step back a little bit first, as an organisation, our goal is to support government with their priorities by aligning them with the interests of what business needs. Now, Yash, you've done the great intro. I don't need to go back down AFCFTA and the need. But what motivates us as we go towards AFCFTA is for that to be successful, you need to deal with trade facilitation, you need to deal with cross-border infrastructure, you need to deal with regional value chains. Why? To reduce the cost of trade, which we've already mentioned. So we do a lot of work on non-tariff barriers, we do a lot of work on cross-border infrastructure, ultimately because transport is such a major cost of trade in our region. So whatever we can do to improve efficiency in the transport sector results in competitive exports and results in unaffordable imports. So that's what really motivates us. In terms of interventions, our longest standing work has been on the North-South Corridor Rail. Again, why? We strongly believe in rail as a long distance bulk commodity form of transport. But we also work a lot on corridor management. We're big advocates for corridor management structures in the North-South Corridor and the Maputo Corridor. So maybe just for the Minister's benefit, we have offered to support those types of structures with the information required to improve day-to-day performance and solve day-to-day non-tariff barriers. As it relates to the North-South Corridor, again, it's been a long journey. What you need to know about corridors is they're extremely complex. The North-South Corridor rail project transcends 6 countries, 7 separate rail operators, all of whom have to be aligned in terms of what the vision is. If it was a single railway line going to a single port in a single jurisdiction, it would be probably quite an easy project. But the reality is that's not the case, and it's not what we're dealing with. So a lot of the work to date, with the support from DBSA, with the support from the World Bank, has been towards driving towards the business case of utilizing to the maximum capacity possible the existing infrastructure on that corridor. The journey has gone very far. We've got to the point where all the feasibility work is done, the system is well understood, the service design is well understood, the customers are well understood. The reality is the first steps now need to be executed, and that relates to rolling stock procurement. It relates to critical repairs, to emergency repairs on the track infrastructure, and building towards the vision of a long-term growing that freight, growing the revenue on that line and growing it into a business that can then start to expand. So that's where we are at this point in time. It does require investment, and it does require somebody to come in and start to buy those trains, to embed those trains, and to have the ability to run those trains on that network. Yes, I guess that's where we are. Just again to say we see rail as medium to long term. It does take a while to get there. In the short term, we have people moving freight on a day-to-day basis. So we need to ensure the best performance of the road corridors, the cross-border infrastructure, the move towards one-stop border posts, etc., is extremely important. I think perhaps just to re-emphasize the importance of data.
Yes.
Because one of the challenges we've always seen in the past is there's lots of data available, but the set of independently generated, trusted data that is accepted by all is often a challenge. So just going back to Yash's talk about NTBs, we've been running a program for 2 or 3 years now on NTBs, and the one that we've identified as the single biggest NTB is the lack of corridor management. So that's something we're driving towards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you've actually touched on a very important point, because, for instance, Namibia have a very strong policy on a weight distance charging, so they know exactly, the actual volumes traveling on their roads. South Africa's busy with that, naturally, in terms of a freight logistic data bank and so on, but data collection is critical. And, you know, I think to just also look at data, STATS-SA data, in terms of actual cargo moved by rail, it's only at 15%. Now, we know the target is roughly at 80%, and that used to be around 25%. Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm using STATS-SA data, not modeled data, so I think one must also sometimes be careful to just assume that modeled data is accurate. But yeah, a critical point that you've raised, you know, in terms of the data. So, I think, you know, going back to SANRAL in terms of, you know, actually focusing on the conditions required for freight infrastructure investment.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think certainly if we are now acknowledging that there's a significant amount of freight on the roads, and that it could be as high as 80-85%. That should be some of it, which is rail friendly, needs to go back to rail in the medium to long term. Things such as mining goods, commodities need to go back to rail. We certainly need to be looking at how do we raise funding in order to continue to maintain the extensive network that is used by trucks in particular. And I guess the one thing that I must say is that the user pay principle remains a very clear government policy. And on our tolls, the conventional boom down tolls, compliance is very high, 99.99%. So that will continue to be the way we need to look at. Of course, one of the things that the minister is championing is, should we not start looking at targeted tolling in some of the routes that we use, such as your N2, your N7, and N1 South, where there is more trucks, and we can look at tolling those particular areas to also make sure that the trucking industry is contributing to maintenance of roads, because that's where a lot of wear and tear comes from. So that's what we need to look at. The funding policy of roads is going out to public comment, and I will imagine those are things we will be tabling very strongly. There is also the use of technology. For us, it's a low-hanging fruit where we can use weigh in motion, the WIM. It's been successfully used, I think, in some of the countries. I think Kenya is one of them. Overseas, very well established. But so we want to do that. It's significantly cheaper relative to your typical traditional weigh bridge, which costs maybe on average 200 million. Weigh in motion will be in the region of $1 million to 2 million per strip. So we can do more with technology. Average speed over distance, we think it's also something that we really need to roll out with our extensive camera network. And so those are some of the things that we think really those who are using the roads more and causing more wear and maintenance should significantly contribute towards maintenance, because we're not going to chase away cargo from the roads without an alternative solution. But we can pay each a fair share for the usage and access of that infrastructure. I think the traditional ways of your triple Ps that the president has been talking about this morning, and other new ways of structuring or raising finance, those are not new at SANRAL. We pioneered triple Ps with the concessions. In fact, our triple Ps are the basis for the National Treasury's regulations. So those things are not new. We have a listed bond on the JSE. So those are traditional ways of funding for us, even though they may be new to others. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. My apologies, I missed you. Do you mind to give us just some thoughts on the single transport economic regulator? I don't know if you want to stand aside or remain seated.
Yes, no, thank you very much. In fact, we always say this, that we used to it as the Department of Transport, so it's not anything new to separate infrastructure from operations. And it's actually working. When people talk about other countries elsewhere, we say no, but in the transport sector, it's happening within the transport sector. They own the road infrastructure, but they're not the operators. So there's competition on the road. It's the same thing with aviation. AXA owns the airports infrastructure, but airlines compete. And this is what we want to bring in other sectors as well, particularly the freight rail sector, to say, let that be the case. And that is exactly what the Economic Transport Regulatory Bill is all about, to bring that access but cost as well, and competition. And once it is passed into law, we hope that the President will sign it into law. It's going to bring this legal framework into existence. And therefore will not, yes, indeed, I agree fully, until such time that we have the ETR. Otherwise, the IREP will be there to do the work. Already they are doing the work in terms of skills that we require, the research that will take us forward. So there's a lot of work that is happening. And indeed, I'm happy that issues of access and cost will now be in one area, because for now, in the aviation sector, we have got the regulating committee that is responsible for setting tariffs. In the port sector, it's the ports regulator. In the road sector, it's SANRAL. And we're bringing all this together. It may not happen just at a go, but we will be bringing that together so that there is competition. We believe that when that happens, then we're going to see freight rail. We're going to see trains running. There may be Chikungas and them train company or your company. For as long as I go to the ETR to apply and they give me the permit to operate, and they say you're going to operate between this area or on this corridor, then I'm going to do that. The state will also do that through the Transnet Freight Rail, as it is happening with SAA, for instance, but it doesn't prevent other airlines to operate. That is what we're looking forward to, with the state owning the infrastructure. And the model of funding, as the CEO has indicated, we might go the concession route, the state route, whatever that we can afford, but we're moving towards deciding even on those issues so that we can, once and for all, remove rail-friendly freight from road to rail. And there is progress that is happening, as you have heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. To you. Yes, Minister, and you know the economic regulation of transport bill also allows for the reduction of tariffs, especially in areas where it wasn't done on a fair basis. So I think that's also a very important aspect of the bill. So, you know, so it's also taking into consideration perhaps past decisions that was not necessarily the best from a commercial perspective or equity perspective. Andrew, are you done? I'm done. We can allow you a minute. We understand that Transnet is really fighting a fire, so we don't blame you. But maybe you can just share with us some of the cross-border rail initiatives and rail projects that Transnet is currently busy with or considering from a planning perspective.
Okay, so I think, Program Director, Transnet's focus on Africa is perhaps less than it had been in the past, given its financial circumstances. So we have to be open and honest around that. In the past, we pursued equity ownership in various concession types and so on, and we've drawn back to that which makes the biggest difference on countries which are immediately adjacent to us, particularly a focus on network connection and expansion. So one of the biggest projects for us is working much more closely with CFM on the corridor down into Maputo. We have a cross-working relationship with CFM as an operator, a rail operator. They have indicated their wish to be able to operate from the Port of Maputo directly to mines, so they will be one of the first new operators on the system, as the Minister had mentioned, competing with ourselves. That process we would hope to unlock in other countries. Eswatini is one where there's also some interest, and certainly the North-South corridor is an area where we hope that this new structure would be able to support additional operators running all the way through from DRC down into the port of Durban. So that's one particular area where I think the regulatory environment is beginning to open up the opportunity for additional operators onto our network, almost operating the SADC region in a more integrated style. But Botswana is one of the areas where there's an interest in moving coal out of the eastern side of Botswana, but there hasn't been a direct request to us to operate on our network, but I would suggest that that probably is a good opportunity. We have established the focus on leasing, rail leasing companies, so we've taken a large portion of what we call our B fleet, which is operational locomotives, mostly diesel, that are not operated on the big bulk corridors, but require considerable rehabilitation. So we have gone out to market to seek a leasing partner, and bringing the B fleets into the system. We know that there's a number of customers in Africa that have a real interest in leasing that fleet, but we've also more recently got customers within South Africa that wish to compete on our own network that want to lease some of that B fleet. So for us, that's an opportunity. And then maybe the last area to mention is TNPA has done considerable work around establishing the Port of Durban as a regional hub, in fact, a Southern Hemisphere hub, which would change maritime traffic in this region substantially. We need to compete with Maputo, Mombasa, Port Louis in Mauritius. All those countries have established performance and invested in infrastructure ahead of us, and we need to catch up. That's really the frank truth of the matter. We have considerable demand in South Africa, so if we're able to put the right port infrastructure in place, the traffic will return back to South Africa and then be transitioned across into other adjacent African countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. So, Yash, in your opinion, what are some of the opportunities for infrastructure development in the continent? Perhaps you can just share some of the examples that you might have been involved with.
Sure. Maybe I think what I will speak to is one of the initiatives that I think is not fully recognized or not often recognized enough. Outer NEPAD's program for infrastructure development in Africa, I think, has been in some ways a game changer for illustrating the potential when there are clear projects for investment and development. And so if you step back again and look at one of the common refrains from financiers, it's often that there are no bankable projects, there are no investable projects, and projects are not at a stage at which they can put money in. And I think PIDA is starting to address that issue and address that gap, alongside the identification of projects at different levels of feasibility and project preparation. I think the initiatives that they've partnered with the likes of African Development Bank on, in terms of providing pools of finance for project preparation, in terms of ensuring that there are clear service delivery mechanisms, and I think especially important for cross-border infrastructure, getting the institutional arrangements right between countries, because often that's the biggest stumbling block to effective infrastructure development between countries. And so the latest initiative from PIDA, their Priority Action Plan 2, I think they've identified roughly 70, I think it's 69 or 70 projects that are either past feasibility stage or just before feasibility stage. And so there's clear initiatives around ensuring that projects are becoming bankable. And then, just in terms of a number of success stories, it was interesting hearing about concessions of roads. And as Sanwaz mentioned, there's a long history for that. The one that I found quite interesting and I guess in some ways innovative in terms of the sector was Beitbridge. So on the Zimbabwean side of the Beitbridge border, a 17-year concession for the development of the border post has recently been completed, and that is fully operational now. I think it was a $300 million US project with a 17-year concession to actually rebuild and manage a border post. And so that is quite different to the tolling of roads or the tariffs that you might incur and charge on a rail network. And I think it's quite a clear, evident success story for how PPPs, partnerships between the private and public sector, can work for all types of infrastructure, not just your kind of clear network-focused rail and road infrastructure. There are a number of other examples beyond the Southern Africa. In East Africa, Namanga one-stop border post, although not a PPP in the true sense of the word, substantial investments there, I think totaling around $100 million US, reducing cross-border traffic times to under 30 minutes. And so significant reduction in the time cost of moving people and goods across borders. And then just maybe the last one I think that's probably worth mentioning, also a relatively recent development, is a Kazungula bridge between Botswana and Zambia. Again, roughly the cost of about $200 million US, not quite a PPP, but a clear evidence of how infrastructure can really improve border transit. And so there, prior to the development of the bridge, trucks were ferried across the river, and waiting times were up to 15 days. With the development of the bridge, that's been reduced to about half a day, even with the substantial increase in truck and people volume. So a number of success stories, and I think it's worth mentioning, given that we are at an infrastructure conference, the role of the likes of PIDA in ensuring that there are clear bankable projects.
Thank you. And they say there's definitely no coincidences in life, because I don't think it's a coincidence that you and Peter are sitting next to each other, because you are always assisting him with the answers. So Peter, perhaps just, the last question, formal question before we make concluding remarks. Just give us your assessment now with all the activities you've been involved with, NEPA Business Forum, in terms of an appetite for, public-private sector collaboration in terms of transport infrastructure delivery.
Yeah, so
You can be honest.
No, just drawing from what you said about PIDA, it's a lot about what we're doing here at the Infrastructure Conference. Without these projects being on lists that are prioritized by governments, people don't look at them. So the reason we worked in the North-South Corridor is because Outer NEPAD is our main partner, and the North-South Corridor was something that needed support. So it does start to crowd in resourcing and activities around projects. So it's hugely important that. In reality, so we partnered with SADC and Outer NEPAD a few years ago on something called the SADC PIDA Acceleration Program. And a lot of that was looking particularly, not just at transport infrastructure, also power and other infrastructure. Definitely huge appetite from the sector for PPPs. The business cases are difficult. Finding PPPs with sufficient revenue streams to make them work, we found, was quite difficult at that point in time. So there is still the affordability issue of the governments themselves in investing in them. Maybe just to think about it a little bit differently, I think a PPP is more of a investor-driven type partnership. I think don't underestimate the collaboration model, looking to users of infrastructure as opposed to the investors in infrastructure, and use a mining model. That when you develop a mine in a stranded place, part of your business case is around developing the infrastructure to support it. So we're seeing a lot of appetite from big transport owners, commodity owners, looking to partner with government on improving efficiencies in transport corridors. So I think don't underestimate the goodwill of business to unlock some of these opportunities and to support government on achieving what they want to achieve in a manner that is obviously a viable manner.
Thank you. I will now allow the panelists just to do concluding remarks. Minister, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Maybe as a way of concluding this session, I just want to say as the continent, particularly on the road and rail, we really do need to harmonize our systems, our procedures, also our legal frameworks or our instruments. As it is possible to anticipate what will happen when you travel by air, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, we can do it even in our road and rail infrastructure or in fact sector. And it starts with the infrastructure itself. It goes on to procedures and legal framework so that we can therefore standardize all these and then know what to expect. When our trucks travel through South Africa, for instance, our trains travel through South Africa and other parts of the continent, they should know what to expect. And that we can do without undermining the sovereignty of states. But we believe that this will enhance the growth of economy, but also the development of our states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Sanral, maybe your views?
No, thanks. I think for me really is to emphasize that we must acknowledge that the state does not have the balance sheet to fund the entire infrastructure development burden on itself. We need private sector participation, and we also need to maintain user pay principle for infrastructure. And those are things that we must accept if we are to have functioning infrastructure network. The other thing is, I think we must also realize, particularly the private sector, that functioning infrastructure is for the benefit of everyone. It is not government's problem. When infrastructure is not working, the economy will not work. And I think we've learned hard lessons. We need to come together, really for the benefit of everyone, our country and the region. South Africa's GDP is probably the biggest if you combine even the entire SADC. So as a country, we cannot even begin to think of a failed country because it means more harm to the region. And I don't think the region can even sustain itself without us. So we are in this together, public sector, private sector, regionally. And let's just pull in one direction and implement. Thank you.
Thank you. Johnson?
I guess from my standpoint as a concluding remarks is that Transnet is in a very different space to the one that it was in perhaps a year or two back. And just as an engagement with our stakeholders, which this forum is around, is to understand the importance of a new Transnet in a very repositioned freight logistics system for port and rail, but even for pipelines. So we are likely to end up with 3 regulated entities. Pipelines is already regulated. TNPA will go through a process, is already in the process of a separation in terms of independent board. And the infrastructure manager will establish a 3rd very large regulatory entity. We then have on the other side of the business 2 key operators, Transnet Port Terminals and Transnet Freight Rail Operations, that will need to increasingly work with the private sector, compete with the private sector and become more agile. I think the Minister referred to the example of SAA. We are very much in that same, very much the same mold from a operations part of our business. So I think when you look forward, some of that will unwind the business in ways that I suppose is going to be difficult for customers and stakeholders to align to. Some of our pricing has been very historic. Some of our contracts are decades and decades old. So as we move into this new regulatory environment in port and rail, that will begin to change. But I think ultimately it will be in the best interests of users of the infrastructure. It will be in the best interests of moving freight from road onto rail. And I suppose what it is also aligns us to be a little bit more like Sandral. We were the last big SOE to be transformed in the way that has now happened through the freight logistics roadmap. So this is for us a big transformational journey. And then just to add, I think what it does do is it enables us to integrate our networks more effectively with networks with our immediate neighbors, particularly the SADC bloc. and to work with those railways and ports more effectively to create a sort of harmonized network over time. Now, that will take probably another 5 to 10 years to do, but at least we're on the road to a transition that I think is very powerful. Thanks.
Yeah, powerful statement. Thank you, Andrew. Yes?
Sure. I won't have much to say. I think from a broader trade policies perspective, if you consider the tortoise and the hare, trade policy is very much the tortoise. Trade policy developments take decades to see themselves out. But I mean, I'm broadly optimistic. We are moving, I think, from what has been a very fragmented approach to development within South Africa, but also across the continent. And I think there is increasing political will to focus on an integrated approach to development that focuses not only on integrated infrastructure approaches, integrated trade approaches, but integrated financing approaches to trade and infrastructure development. So optimistic, but recognize that it's a very long game. Thanks.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I'll probably just finish where I started. You know, that this stuff's important. You know, it's important that we bring down the cost of trade. It's good for our economy. It's good for our neighbours' economies. But in doing that, recognize there's no shortcuts. You know, preparing infrastructure is difficult. I know when I first got into the role I'm in now, there were a lot of people saying, let's start this project, it'll be across the line in 6 months. It's not like that. It's very difficult. There's processes. A lot of what's been talked about here recognizes that. And it's important that we do those steps properly first time around, so you don't have to go backwards and repeat them again. So, yeah, huge opportunity in my mind, but not easy to do given the complexity of cross-border type projects.
Thank you. I will now allow the audience just 2 questions, and can I kindly request that you keep the questions quite concise? And then after that, the relevant panel member will answer and reply to your questions, and then I'll just ask the panel to stay behind, as we also have to allow the next team to come and prepare. Any questions from the audience? Going. Okay.
Tokir Ahmed from the TNPA, Ports Authority. I think more just a comment. I would definitely encourage, the move from road to rail. We are suffering in the ports, Richards Bay, Saldanha, starting at Mokhana as well. The trucks are just flooding the ports. And not only flooding the ports and congesting the ports, but damaging the roads there. And so the ports were not designed to handle that level of traffic. Yes, we can handle, heavy trucks, but now and then not as frequent as we're experiencing right now, and it is causing damages. And if you damage infrastructure, it costs us to fix it up, and again, user pay principle in support from our side. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone want? Okay, there's a question at the back, and you want?
Good afternoon, everybody. Ricardo Temes. I'm from the AIDC Eastern Cape Automotive Industry Development Centre, Eastern Cape. To the Minister and the panelists, thank you so much for your inputs. It's encouraging to learn that at a very high level there's integration taking place from a transportation perspective. From the auto sector perspective, and if I listen to Sandra speak and to the other panelists, the users are ready to pay. When I think about moving certain commodities from road to rail, the automotive sector are chomping at the bit, really, to transport vehicles north-south in this country, as well as outside the borders of South Africa. And then, if you look at where the automotive sector is going, from a new energy vehicle perspective, getting raw materials from our neighboring countries into South Africa to beneficiate that into battery technology, etc., the conversations that I've been hearing this afternoon will enable that, Minister. And so what we are saying from the automotive sector, the sooner all of these initiatives can be projectized and happen, the beneficiaries such as the automotive sector are really waiting for that to happen. And speaking to the likes of, if I have to name them, Ford South Africa, VW South Africa, Isuzu, etc., They will pay to use rail systems where they can put their products on. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I will break my own rule and allow the last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Arthur Martin from Select New Energies. Also to comment on the volumes are there for long term, especially from green energy. There's a lot of projects, green energy projects, which are going to produce hydrogen, and hydrogen needs to be moved. And that's normally moved in ammonia or in methanol. And we're initially looking at right now, by 2032, about 1 million tons of that has to be moved. And that's rail. So my question and comment to Transnet Freight Rail is timelines. It's really important because we need to make investment decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the first two were more comments, so we will not respond to that. We will conclude now with Andrew.
I suppose if I can answer the question in two parts. The first part is that as we go through this transition where we separate infrastructure from operations, is that anybody can move an ammonia train. They just need to get a slot, and they need to bring their very diverse rolling stock, and they need to operate. So yes, we have some of that equipment on the system. Some of it is dated, but we have recently reinvested in a lot of our chemical rolling stock through SASL, etc. So we would want to position for that market, but anybody could position for that market. We've done a hydrogen study because we have identified through our ESG approach the importance of the hydrogen economy. One of the things that comes out of that study is that actually we would foresee less hydrogen moved in as ammonia by rail and more of it taken to export source. So potentially the demand on rail is perhaps less than we had initially thought. One of our key projects is Boegoebaai in the Northern Cape. And the anchor for that we still regard as hydrogen based on solar produced hydrogen and export from there. So those are our two kind of responses to that. I guess if the hydrogen economy really takes off, it will require additional new investments in terminals and other things that will have to be interfaced with the rail and port network that we haven't yet considered. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. So we've had the last question. Now we'll go to the final last question.
Good afternoon, Minister and the panelists. I couldn't help but raise my hand because I know you stopped at the last speaker who had a question. I think for me, the discussions have been mainly centered around, transport infrastructure from a trade point of view. My name is Abigail Tulare. I'm the CEO of Robben Island Museum. And I think my plea, and I think that's why I was forced to raise my hand, to say perhaps transport infrastructure should also be looked at from a perspective of a social good and movement of people, because we are an island and currently we are relying on the ferries to ferry our people, and the whole issue is access in preserving the heritage and conserving the heritage, not only for the current generations, but the generations in future. So, Minister, I think for me is my plea to take that into consideration. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think we've come to the concluding part, and I really would just like to thank my panel. Minister, thank you. We really value your time. And my colleagues will just hand out some gifts to the panel members. Sanral, Transnet, DNA Economics, NEPAP.
Thanks so much. Who's the DNA guy who used to do that bad work? Always used to wear like a Scottish little Elias.
Okay, and yourself?
Andrew, can we quickly take a picture? Please stand aside.